Nous avions une relation sécuritaire. Elle était de deux natures, en vérité. Il y a une partie, c'était notre engagement contre le terrorisme depuis 2013. On avait raison.
For a long time, nothing exploded. No protests, no angry press conferences, no dramatic break with Paris. That's why France didn't notice what was happening. African governments simply stopped calling. Deals France once assumed were automatic began going elsewhere. Projects were signed quietly. Financing was secured without Paris in the room. There was no rejection to react to, only absence. And absence is harder to fight than hostility. Inside French ministries, the numbers eventually caught up with the silence. Market share shrinking, contracts disappearing, influence thinning. Not because France was pushed out, but because it hesitated while others moved fast. This wasn't a retreat in uniform or a diplomatic crisis played out on television. It was something colder, a slow realization that Africa no longer needed permission, patience, or protection. And when Paris finally understood what had happened, it didn't announce a strategy. It began scrambling to rewrite one. So, what are they trying to do now? Let's find out. It didn't begin with protests, coups, or public humiliation. France's realization came in a far more unsettling way. Nothing happened. Phones that once rang stopped ringing. Invitations that once came automatically no longer arrived. Deals that France assumed were routine quietly went to someone else, signed without drama, without explanation, without negotiation. Inside French ministries, the first signs appeared in internal trade briefs. Year after year, exports to Africa were technically rising, yet something felt off. The growth looked healthy on paper, but influence was evaporating. When officials dug deeper, the pattern became impossible to ignore. France was still selling, but it was no longer deciding. Being present had replaced being preferred. Then came the comparative data, the moment panic set in. Africa's overall trade volume was exploding, but France's share was shrinking. Markets that France once treated as stable were now dominated by unfamiliar competitors. Infrastructure projects, logistics contracts, digital systems, and even basic financing arrangements were being finalized without French firms even reaching the final stage. What made it worse was the silence from Africa itself. There were no angry speeches, no diplomatic rows, no ideological rejection. African governments didn't complain, they simply moved on. That silence was the clearest signal that something fundamental had changed. The shock intensified when France realized where it was losing ground. Not just in Anglophone Africa, not just in emerging markets, but in Francophone countries, places where French firms once assumed privileged access. Projects that would have gone to Paris by habit were now open tenders, and France was losing them. At first, French officials told themselves this was temporary, a cycle, a correction. But the losses kept spreading across sectors: transport, energy, construction, and finance. Even French banks began quietly closing or scaling down African operations, citing risk and compliance, leaving space for others to fill. The most alarming realization came late. France had not been pushed out. No one expelled it from trade. No policy banned it. France had slowly priced itself out through hesitation, bureaucracy, and fear, while others acted. This is when the word existential started appearing in internal discussions, not because France was broke, but because relevance once lost is almost impossible to reclaim. Africa was no longer a captive market. It was a competitive arena, and France was arriving late to fights it once controlled. By the time Paris acknowledged what was happening, the damage was already structural. Supply chains had shifted, relationships had deepened elsewhere. Trust had been reassigned, and that raised the uncomfortable question France could no longer avoid. If Africa didn't push France away, why did France step back at the exact moment others stepped forward? The answer is uncomfortable for Paris, but simple. France stepped back because it stopped believing in Africa as a place to commit and started treating it as a place to manage risk. That mental shift happened quietly, inside banks, insurers, and corporate legal departments, long before politicians noticed. Over the past decade, French financial institutions began tightening exposure to African markets. Compliance rules multiplied. Risk committees demanded higher guarantees. Insurance premiums rose. Projects that once took months to approve now took years, if they were approved at all. In boardrooms, Africa stopped being framed as an opportunity and started being framed as a vulnerability. Capital reacts faster than diplomacy. When French banks pulled back, large French firms followed. Infrastructure companies couldn't secure financing. Energy firms struggled with guarantees. Construction giants hesitated on timelines. One delay led to another, and Africa, which was moving faster than ever, did not wait. At the same time, others moved in with a very different mindset. China treated Africa as a long-term strategic space, not a quarterly risk assessment. Financing was bundled, construction was rapid, decisions were centralized. Turkey entered aggressively, undercutting prices and delivering quickly. India focused on services, pharmaceuticals, and technology sectors France had underestimated. African governments didn't hold ideological debates about this shift. They made practical calculations. Roads needed to be built, power grids expanded, ports modernized, digital systems installed. Whoever could deliver, on time and at scale, won the contracts. Sentiment did not matter. Performance did. France began losing deals not because its technology was inferior, but because its process was slower. By the time French firms finalized internal approvals, competitors had already broken ground. In some cases, France didn't even make it to the final bidding stage. What made this retreat especially damaging was that it happened silently. France never announced it was pulling back. It simply stopped showing up with money ready, decisions made, and timelines fixed. That silence was interpreted in Africa not as prudence, but as disinterest. Even in countries where France had decades of relationships, trust began to erode. Officials learned that French commitments came with caveats, delays, and reversals. Meanwhile, others showed consistency. Over time, African states stopped calling Paris first, not out of resentment, but habit. This is how France lost ground without losing face publicly. No rupture, no confrontation, just absence. By the time Paris realized what had happened, Africa's economic map had already been redrawn. Supply chains reassigned, partnerships deepened, dependencies diversified. And once France finally looked up from its risk assessments, it had to confront a sobering reality. Was this retreat a temporary pause, or had France permanently taught Africa not to rely on it anymore? Because once Africa learns not to rely on you, trust doesn't reset on command. That was the conclusion Emmanuel Macron reached when the data was laid out in front of him, stripped of diplomacy, excuses, and historical comfort. President Emmanuel Macron didn't discover France's decline through headlines. He discovered it through internal trade breakdowns that showed a disturbing pattern. France wasn't just losing contracts, it was losing position. Exports to Africa were rising, yes, but Africa itself was growing much faster. That meant France's role was shrinking in relative terms and shrinking fast. Market share had fallen to roughly 4.2%. Meanwhile, China's share hovered around 17%, with others climbing steadily. This wasn't a fluctuation, it was structural displacement. Macron's response, delivered in a closed meeting with French ambassadors in Paris, was unusually blunt. There was no attempt to soften the message. He said the decline was self-inflicted. Excessive regulation, corporate fear, financial timidity, a culture that rewarded caution over ambition. France, he admitted, had strangled its own presence in Africa while pretending everything was fine. What made this moment critical wasn't the criticism, it was the urgency. Macron warned that France was approaching an existential moment in Africa, not because the continent was hostile, but because relevance once lost cannot be reclaimed with speeches. Africa was no longer dependent. It was a choice. For over a decade, French banks and financial institutions had quietly retreated from African markets. Macron saw that this retreat had consequences beyond balance sheets. Without finance, French companies couldn't compete. Without speed, they couldn't win. Without presence, they couldn't influence outcomes. The ecosystem that once sustained French dominance had hollowed out. Macron's instruction was direct: stop treating Africa like a risk problem and start treating it like a strategic priority again. He demanded that ministers push French firms back into African markets and remove the internal brakes that had paralyzed decision-making. The tone wasn't nostalgic, it was alarmist. What France underestimated was how fast perception travels. Once African publics and elites saw France being pushed out militarily, the image of France as a reliable long-term partner weakened everywhere, not just in the Sahel. Even countries without coup began reassessing relationships, not because they hated France, but because they no longer feared losing it. That distinction matters. Fear once stabilized French influence. Its absence now destabilizes it. This is why France's current trade push feels strained. Paris speaks of partnership and mutual benefit, but Africa remembers hierarchy and intervention. France wants to sell a future-oriented narrative, but the recent past is too fresh to ignore. Every deal is filtered through memory. Every proposal is weighed against history. And unlike before, African governments now have alternatives. They don't need to tolerate discomfort to secure infrastructure, financing, or technology. If France hesitates, another partner steps in. If France lectures, another listens. That flexibility changes everything. France is learning painfully that economic strategy cannot succeed if political legitimacy has eroded. You cannot reboot trade while ignoring why trust collapsed in the first place. You cannot ask to be treated as a neutral partner while the memory of dominance remains unresolved. This is the contradiction at the heart of France's Africa strategy. It wants a clean economic reset without a political reckoning. But Africa is no longer willing to compartmentalize. The continent connects power, history, and commerce into one equation, and France is being judged on all three. Which brings us to the final dilemma Paris can no longer avoid. Is this aggressive trade push a genuine reinvention, or simply France's last attempt to stay relevant before Africa fully moves on? The answer is that this push is not a renaissance, it's a countdown. France is not trying to reclaim dominance, it is trying to avoid irrelevance. The strategy unfolding now is shaped by a simple realization in Paris. Africa no longer needs France to function, finance, or grow. That reality has already set in. What hasn't settled yet is whether France can still justify a seat at the table. This is why the tone has changed. France is no longer talking about leadership, it's talking about participation, no longer about guidance, about partnership, no longer about history, about utility. These aren't ideological shifts, they are survival adjustments. France understands that Africa's economic future will be decided with or without it, and that exclusion this time would be permanent. The urgency comes from competition that isn't slowing down. China isn't retreating. Turkey isn't hesitating. India isn't overthinking. Africa's growth trajectory favors partners who move fast, finance boldly, and respect sovereignty openly. France, for the first time, must compete on those exact terms, stripped of privilege, stripped of deference, stripped of automatic access. This is the uncomfortable part Paris rarely says aloud. France is now replaceable, not hated, not rejected, just optional. And being optional in Africa today is more dangerous than being opposed, because it means silence, not confrontation. The current strategy, summits, trade pitches, diaspora engagement, and climate finance is designed to prove usefulness quickly. France is trying to show it can still add value in a continent that already has alternatives. That is why there is no patience in this push, no slow rebuilding, no gradual trust exercises. Time is not on France's side. Africa's position, meanwhile, is clear even if it's rarely stated directly. The continent is no longer negotiating from insecurity. It doesn't need to compromise dignity for development. It doesn't need to tolerate imbalance for access. It can choose, and it knows it. This shift is what truly defines the moment. France isn't facing an African backlash, it's facing African confidence. That confidence changes the rules of engagement entirely. Deals are transactional. Respect is non-negotiable. Delivery matters more than rhetoric. But here's the key shift. Macron no longer spoke as if France had a right to Africa. He spoke as if France had to earn its way back. That distinction matters. It shows Paris understands, at least internally, that the old order is gone. Still, realization is not recovery. Admitting decline doesn't reverse it. Africa had already diversified its partnerships, reassigned trust, and learned to function without French backing. So the real problem Macron faced wasn't denial, it was timing. And that led to the next move, the one designed to prove France wasn't just talking. If France had lost influence in its traditional African strongholds, where could it even begin to rebuild? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. The answer was simple and humiliating. France could not rebuild influence where it had already lost legitimacy. The traditional strongholds, Francophone West Africa, the Sahel, and former military hubs, were no longer repair sites. They were rupture zones. Too much history, too much resentment, too many broken assumptions. So Paris did something it had never done before. It changed geography. Instead of doubling down on shrinking ground, France decided to step outside it. The pivot was deliberate and symbolic. The Africa-France summit would no longer rotate between Paris and friendly Francophone capitals. For the first time, it would be held in Nairobi, a city that represents everything France had failed to dominate but now desperately needed to access. This wasn't about venue aesthetics. Nairobi sits at the crossroads of East Africa's trade corridors, financial services, tech ecosystems, and logistics networks. It is plugged into Anglophone Africa, global capital flows, and emerging markets, where France had always been peripheral. By choosing Nairobi, France was quietly admitting something it would never say out loud. Its old sphere was shrinking, and its future, if it had one, lay elsewhere. The decision was finalized after Macron met William Ruto on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. The message wasn't framed as France hosting Africa. It was framed as France showing up on Africa's terms in Africa's chosen space. That distinction matters. For decades, Africa came to France. Now France was traveling outward, repositioning itself as one participant among many in a crowded field. The summit's themes, trade innovation, digital finance, and climate investment, were carefully selected. They avoided security, avoided history, and avoided politics. This was about rebranding France as modern, useful, and commercially relevant. But beneath the polished language was anxiety. France wasn't just expanding eastward. It was escaping the weight of its past. In Nairobi, France could talk about startups and climate funds without confronting military expulsions, coups, and colonial memory head-on. Still, this move carried risk. Shifting arenas doesn't erase reputation. East Africa is not neutral ground. It is already crowded with players who arrived earlier, stayed longer, and delivered faster. France wasn't entering an empty room. It was walking into a competitive market where it lacked privilege. That is what made the Nairobi decision so revealing. It wasn't confidence, it was a necessity. France was betting that starting fresh in unfamiliar territory was easier than repairing trust where it had collapsed. And that gamble leads directly to the problem France cannot sidestep forever. Can a trade reset succeed when the political damage that caused the decline remains unresolved? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Trade does not float above politics anymore. It is anchored to it. The moment France's political authority cracked in Africa, its commercial credibility cracked with it. And that rupture happened publicly, dramatically, and in places that once formed the backbone of French influence. The turning point was the Sahel. When military juntas in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger expelled French troops and diplomats, it wasn't just a security setback. It was a signal to the entire continent that France's authority was no longer unquestioned or even welcome. Power, once broken, doesn't quietly repair itself. For decades, French trade benefited from political gravity. French companies operated in environments shaped by French diplomacy, French security guarantees, and informal influence networks. When that scaffolding collapsed, the business didn't stay neutral. Contracts became harder to defend. Financing became riskier. Political protection disappeared. So what happens next doesn't depend on speeches in Paris or summits in Nairobi. It depends on the results. Can France finance faster, build quicker, partner without control, accept equality without resentment? Because Africa will not wait to find out. This is not about whether France returns to Africa. France never fully left. The real question is sharper and far more unforgiving. Can France accept an Africa where it is no longer central, but still relevant? Let us know in the comment section. Should France lose hope? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.